It's important that people understand who this individual was. So he was previously the commander of Hezbollah's elite Radwan force, the most capable, most dangerous of Hezbollah's terror array. The distraction of 8 rockets that were positioned for potential launch into Israel from within the Gaza Strip. And there is remarkable footage that accompanies Israel's strike against that eventuality. A number of the terrorists who were holed up in these tunnels inside the Gaza Strip have been killed. It's right that they be eliminated. It's right that the Israel Defense Forces expresses that they are to be targeted for elimination. The Muslim Brotherhood is obviously anti-Israel. It is a terror organization that is also anti-American. It's high time that it be officially proscribed, but doing so is not simple. It's a very complex issue. Hi folks, thank you very much for tuning into this episode of the Benjamin Anthony Show. Before we get going, if you're enjoying this content, I just want to ask you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel by hitting the subscribe button and by clicking on the bell notification. That will ensure that you get all of our latest content and all of our groundbreaking images and footage. And remember, if you have an issue that you want us to discuss, please let us know about that in the comments section, and we'll do our best to respond to that and to get to what's on your mind. And if you're following us by way of audio podcasts, please remember to subscribe to the podcast and to leave a rating and review at wherever it is that you download your podcast from. Doing both of those things really does help us to reach an ever wider audience, and I thank you in advance of your partnership in that regard. And with that, it's on with the show. So the first topic that I'd like to discuss today is the elimination of the chief of staff, essentially, of the terror organization Hezbollah. That is Chief of Staff Tabatabai. And he was taken out earlier this week in a strike by the Israel Defense Forces that the IDF actually released the footage of. You can see that there was a strike that took place on a multi-story building. It's important that people understand who this individual was. So he was previously the commander of Hezbollah's elite Radwan force. That is the most capable, most dangerous of Hezbollah's terror array. He was also tasked with, at one time, leading a raid by Hezbollah into northern Israel in a style that would have been very similar indeed to the raid that we witnessed take place on October 7th by Hamas into southern Israel. And it's worth me pausing here and saying that I well remember, again, during the course of my reserve duty when I was stationed up in the north of Israel along the border with Lebanon, that one of the things that we were practicing, and I'm going back a number of years now, was the response of the IDF in the event that Hezbollah launched a terror raid across southern Lebanon into northern Israel, took control of our people, took control of northern villages inside the country, and that the IDF would have to be deployed in order to turn that threat back on its face and to rescue and recover any Israelis and towns that had fallen under the capture and conquest of Hezbollah. So this was the man who was charged with organizing that extremely sinister outcome. And as a result of that, it's of course better that he not be here. To understand just how high up he was subordinate only to Naim Qasim, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, having acceded to that position after the elimination of Hassan Nasrallah by the Israel Defense Forces. People will recall that that took place during the course of Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech at the UN General Assembly in September of 2024. So this is a very senior member of this terror organization. A lot of people will wonder, what is the benefit of targeted eliminations such as this? The most important aspect that people should understand about the targeting and elimination of terror leaders is that it results in the temporary but very significant discombobulation of the command and control structure of that given organization. Individuals such as this are not simply in ready supply. Now, somebody will take his place, that's for sure. Somebody will take up the position that he held, that's for certain. but they won't necessarily bring all of the experience that he had. They won't necessarily have the capabilities that he had. And in addition to discombobulating, therefore, the command and control structure of Hezbollah's terror army, what you're also doing is you're pushing the organization writ large onto the back foot, and you're also pushing it further underground, making all of its communications, all of its logistics ever more complicated. And remember, this is a terror organization that already has massive obstacles when it comes to its day-to-day operations, because it knows, as we learned from the Beeper operation launched by the Mossad, it knows that it's being tracked, it knows it's being traced, it knows it's being watched, and that knowledge culminates in it being very, very slow moving compared to the pace that it would like to keep up. The other thing that I think people should keep in mind is that this is reflective of the fact that the Israel Defense Forces is taking an aggressive stance against terror threats emanating from southern Lebanon. Now, that is a huge, significant, welcomed turnaround from the attitude of the defense establishment that was pervasive prior to the horrors of October the 7th. I applaud Israel for taking a much more offensive footing with regard to repelling these terror threats. But I also want to remind everybody that I warned at the time that the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon was brokered after Israel scored tremendous victories in its battle against Hezbollah during the course of this war, that the ceasefire terms were inadequate. During the fighting and prior to the fighting between the IDF and Hezbollah, there were multiple calls by the leadership in Israel for the need to enforce Resolution 1701 and for the need to establish a buffer zone beyond which Hezbollah would be banished and within which Hezbollah would not be tolerated. That buffer zone, which was put forward as a central goal of the conflict against Hezbollah, never came to fruition. And so what this has left us with is the need to enforce very, very forcefully our new doctrine of eliminating terror threats as and when they emerge, and as and when they present themselves for that elimination. In terms of what Hezbollah can do when it comes to seeking some sort of vengeance, I think that Hezbollah is a far more weakened force than it was prior to October the 7th. Everybody understands that, including them. But that's the reason that I'm very concerned that you will see them seeking to target softer targets rather than a frontal confrontation with the Israel Defense Forces, rather than firing rockets en masse towards the home front, as we feared for so many years as they built up their arsenal of more than 100,000 munitions pointed towards Israel. What you're likely to see is Hezbollah targeting softer targets such as Diaspora Jewry, such as Israeli installations abroad, including consulates, that sort of thing. So time will tell whether or not that happens. Thankfully, we've learned that the Mossad is proving itself, as we hoped, to be a very effective interdictor of such terror plans overseas against diaspora Jewry and Jewish installations. So that's where we are, I believe, with Hezbollah. One final point, this shows just how unrealistic it is to expect that Joseph Aoun, president of Lebanon, is going to actually rise to the condition of the ceasefire, that which dictates that he is to disarm Hezbollah from its weapons, that there will be a monopoly on weapons, and that monopoly will be the exclusive preserve of the Lebanese armed forces, or LAF, as they perhaps are appropriately referred to by their acronym. He's not fulfilling that role. He is continuing to protest against Israel's right to defend itself and to preempt these terror attacks and to take out these terror leaders. Eventually, I believe that if Joseph Aoun fails to do that which he signed up to do, and if Hezbollah continues to seek to reconstitute itself in various areas throughout southern Lebanon, we may well come to another frontal offensive launched by the IDF against Hezbollah infrastructure inside southern Lebanon in the very near future. The next topic that I want to discuss is the distraction of 8 rockets that were positioned for potential launch into Israel from within the Gaza Strip. And there is remarkable footage that accompanies Israel's strike against that eventuality. What I want everybody to really try and understand is that, to me, this is the proof positive of what I have been saying for many, many months with regard to the long-term resolution and outcome that I believe will bring long-term quiet to the people of Israel with regard to the Gaza Strip. And it may be popular, it may be unpopular for me to say this, but I'm going to express it once again. For the longest time, I have been saying that given that on October the 7th, the preponderance of Gazans celebrated the kidnapping of our men, our women, our children, our elderly, and our infirm, as they were paraded throughout the streets of Gaza in footage that was released by Hamas. When you consider that the preponderance of Gazans celebrated when they saw IDF soldiers who had been killed being dragged through the streets of Gaza, in some cases with their entrails hanging out. When you consider that the masses of Gaza celebrated when our hostages were paraded in the most emaciated form that I believe a human being can possibly take, when you consider that they chant and support Hamas, you have to understand, and it's important for people to internalize this reality, that as long as that population remains on the border with the state of Israel, the state of Israel will not know long-term peace, and it will not even know long-term quiet. And this loops back to the discovery and distraction of these 8 rockets that were being prepared, because the terror army that once was Hamas is replenishing its ranks, and it is doing so because there is ready willingness from among the men of age inside the Gaza Strip. As long as you have a dynamic where the people are fueled by hatred towards their neighbor Israel, as long as you have a dynamic where they are powered by a jihadism that leaders in the West clearly fail to understand, but we in Israel now understand better than ever as a result of the horrors of October the 7th, as long as that group of people remains right on the borders with Israel, the state of Israel will not know quiet. And so I do not know what the long-term outcome will be inside the Gaza Strip, but I would implore the Prime Minister of Israel and others to consider again facilitating the relocation of the Gazan population at the point of them requesting relocation. This is not something that should be overlooked. And if we allow the replenishment of Hamas's terror army against us, October 7th will be rendered not a war of great victory as it ought to be seen, but rather a precursor to a return of the flawed and dangerous policy that existed prior to October 7th, namely mowing the lawn, a policy that I always railed against, I always viewed as actually a non-policy, and I deeply hope we will not return to. So at the moment, we're striking as and when it's needed, but I think eventually there needs to be a long-term resolution brought about that separates the Gazan people from the borders with Israel. On a different topic now, what we've seen is that a number of the terrorists who were holed up in these tunnels inside the Gaza Strip have been killed by the Israel Defense Forces. And it seems to be that a few of these terrorists actually came out of the tunnels because they were foraging for food and for water and for sustenance. Incidentally, the very sustenance that was clearly denied our hostages who have been for so long had been held in those tunnels as well while in Hamas captivity. It's right that they be eliminated. It's right that the Israel Defense Forces expresses that they are to be targeted for elimination. And it speaks to the fact, the continued terror operations that are taking place and that are being attempted inside the Gaza Strip, both above ground and below ground, incidentally, speaks to the reality that Hamas never actually agreed to the full phase and the full run of the ceasefire agreement that was put forward. If one goes back and looks at the Hamas response that President Trump published on his social media page, there is an agreement for the return of the hostages, and everything thereafter seems to be something that Hamas is not prepared to agree to, including disarming itself, including relinquishing power, and including the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip. So when we think about the durability of this ceasefire, I think that we already have the answer. They have not ceased firing on members of the Israel Defense Forces, and they're not going to cease firing as long as they're in possession of their arms and powered by this jihadist, destructive, religious ideology that calls for the elimination not only of the states of Israel, but Jewish people everywhere. That's what we're up against, and that's why when the commander of the Golani Brigade expresses that these people will be targeted for elimination, he's absolutely right to do so. Such a standard is appropriate, and nobody should be expecting Israel to accept anything short of that. Another issue that I wanted to discuss today is the designation by President Donald Trump of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terror organization. And it's welcome news. It's welcome news. It's appropriate. It's proper. And it actually follows the leadership of Governor Greg Abbott, incidentally, of the great state of Texas. And I'm actually going to read what Governor Abbott stated on November the 18th of this year. He said, quote, "The Muslim Brotherhood and CARE have long made their goals clear: to forcibly impose Sharia law and establish Islam's mastership of the world." He goes on to say, "The actions taken by the Muslim Brotherhood and CARE," that's C-A-I-R, CARE, the organization, "to support terrorism across the globe and subvert our laws through violence, intimidation, and harassment are unacceptable." Abbott went on to state, "Today, I designated the Muslim Brotherhood and CARE as foreign terrorist organizations and transnational criminal organizations. These radical extremists are not welcome in our state and are now prohibited from acquiring any real property interest in Texas." So that is the statement by Governor Greg Abbott. And I feel that that helped to build the momentum for President Trump's statement where he proscribes them as a terror organization. Now, this organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, is obviously anti-Israel. It is a terror organization that is also anti-American. It's high time that it be officially proscribed, but doing so is not simple. It's a very complex issue, because we're seeing that the United States is working closely and drawing ever closer to some sort of collaboration, cooperation, partnership, alliance with two very problematic international players when it comes to the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood and other issues besides that. The first being Turkey. Erdogan is a patron, a fan, a lover of the Muslim Brotherhood, of which Hamas, be very, very clear, is a spin-off. And of course, Qatar is a patron of Hamas and funded Hamas, the buildup of Hamas inside the Gaza Strip, so that Hamas was in a position ultimately to carry out the October 7th massacre. So President Trump has designated the Muslim Brotherhood as a terror organization, but the United States administration under the leadership of President Trump seems to be drawing ever closer to two of the Muslim Brotherhood's patrons. That's a very, very interesting complexity. We'll watch this space when it comes to how that it develops. Separately from that, the Muslim Brotherhood actually has a very central role when it comes to assessing the likelihood for success of the International Stabilization Force that recently passed the United Nations Security Council and was ratified by them to be deployed, formed up, and stood up inside the Gaza Strip. Because that International Stabilization Force, the brainchild of President Trump, is comprised of very, very strange bedfellows indeed. There is an idea currently that within that force, inside the Gaza Strip, very, very close indeed to the state of Israel, there will be military representation in whatever form and with whatever mandate. That will all be dealt with in the fullness of time. We don't know yet what that will look like, but there will be an international force that will include the Turkish military and the Qatari military. Now, Israel has railed against the idea that Qatar would have forces inside the Gaza Strip, and it's done so with even greater intensity against the idea that Turkey would have its forces inside the Gaza Strip for reasons everybody understands. Erdogan has revealed himself as a double-dyed hater of the state of Israel, and I would say an unmasked anti-Semite, peddling notions against Israel and the Jewish people that really are reminiscent of what we used to hear during the Third Reich. So you'd have these two patrons of the Muslim Brotherhood, potentially, and therefore sympathizers and supporters of Hamas as a result, operating in the Gaza Strip alongside another component of this force, namely Egypt, which absolutely reviles the Muslim Brotherhood. People will probably recall that Sisi, after the fall of Mubarak during the ill-named Arab Spring, saw the ascendance to power of Morsi. Morsi was the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. Sisi, concerned for the stability of Egypt, then launched what was essentially a military coup against the Morsi government, toppled Morsi, and seized power. So determined was Sisi not to have the Muslim Brotherhood in positions of power in his beloved Egypt. So given that you have these two very clearly opposing considerations and attitudes towards the Muslim Brotherhood, I don't understand how Israel is expected to accept a situation where an international stabilization force right on its border has Turkish components, Qatari components, Egyptian components, who will not be able to work in harmony with each other, and yet Israel is expected to accept, will be able to disarm Hamas and to pacify the Gaza Strip. It's completely, totally, and utterly ridiculous. And I am very, very hopeful that America will end up taking a very strong stand against Qatar's double dealings. Whether or not that happens, we don't know, but it ought to happen. And a final word on this, I think that ultimately, as a citizen of the State of Israel, as someone who votes in the State of Israel, as somebody who loves the State of Israel as much as I do, it's also appropriate that I criticize the policies of the State of Israel. And at bottom, I believe that what took place on October the 7th, while the doing was entirely the doing of Hamas, the responsibility for Hamas to reach the position that it did, where it could launch such a murderous rampage against our people, is in no small part the result of a deeply flawed policy by the government of the State of Israel, namely propping up Hamas with Qatari cash, assuming that Hamas could be bought off, assuming that Hamas could be pacified by way of wealth and financial sustenance. All of that was dreadfully mistaken. It was a policy that was too complex to possibly make any sense when analyzed with any seriousness. And I do very much hope that that practice is now ended, and ended permanently. Finally, with regard to the United States, everybody should be aware the Muslim Brotherhood expressed in the 1990s, even in the early 1990s, that they were going to unwind the cohesion of America in favor of their jihadist goals, and they were going to do so through the use of mosques, through the use of American campuses, through the hallways of elected offices, and through the use of non-government organizations or NGOs. They've done all of that very, very successfully. All of that must be clamped for the benefit of the broader American body. And for that reason, it's a blessed outcome that President Trump has designated the Muslim Brotherhood a proscribed terror organization. I just wanted to let you know about two incredible events that we've got coming up live. The first is in Florida and the second is in Manhattan. On December the 10th, in Wynwood, Miami, Florida, we will be hosting a live conversation with 2 of the last 20 hostages to be released from inside captivity in the Gaza Strip. Those 2 hostages are Eviatar David and Guy Gilboa Dalal. Some of you will remember that the 2 hostages were driven to watch other hostages being released before being returned to the dungeons of Gaza. And at that same event, we will be hosting a conversation on why America needs a strong Israel. And our speaker is none other than former Secretary of State, former Director of the CIA, the Honorable Mike Pompeo. So that is December the 10th in Wynwood, Miami, Florida. And then on December the 16th in Midtown Manhattan, New York, we will be hosting the same 2 released hostages, Guy Gilboa Dalal and Eviatar David, for a Hanukkah celebration of their freedom. I'm going to put the links for where you can register in the description of this show. Whether you're watching us on YouTube or listening to the podcast, please be sure to get your tickets now and join these 2 released hostages as they celebrate their freedom.